When Indians talk about partition, we usually think of 1947, India and Pakistan, millions displaced. But 10 years before that, India had already been partitioned. A territory larger than France was cut away from India, a land that had been governed from Calcutta, a place where lakhs of Indians lived and worked, a province whose capital, Rangoon, was one of the richest cities in Asia. And yet, today, almost nobody remembers it as a part of India. This is the story of how India lost Burma. Look at the map of Asia today. India ends at the border of Myanmar. It feels natural, as if things had always been this way. But until 1937, Burma was governed as a part of British India. The same viceroy who governed Punjab governed Burma. The same rupee circulated in both the places. And then, in 1937, that changed. So, what happened? Why was Burma separated from India? And why has this enormous event vanished from India's memory? The story begins with war. In the 19th century, the British East India Company was expanding aggressively from Bengal. After conquering Bengal, Awadh, Mysore, and the Marathas, the company turned eastward towards the Burmese kingdom. The British and the Burmese fought three wars: the First Anglo-Burmese War in 1824, the Second in 1852, and the Third in 1885. After the final victory, the British deposed King Thibaw and exiled him not to London but to Ratnagiri in western India. That detail tells you everything. The British did not treat Burma as a separate colony. They attached it to British India and administered it through the same imperial system that governed Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. In many ways, Burma became India's eastern frontier. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Calcutta and Rangoon became deeply linked. Ships moved constantly between these two cities. Merchants, laborers, clerks, and businessmen crossed the Bay of Bengal. To many Bengalis, Rangoon was not a distant foreign land, but a place where opportunities existed, where relatives lived and worked, and one deeply connected to the economy of eastern India. What followed was one of the largest migration movements across the Bay of Bengal. Drawn by jobs and opportunity, hundreds of thousands of people moved eastward from British India into Burma. Rangoon grew into a bustling colonial metropolis, and Indian communities became increasingly visible in the workforce, commerce, and administration. By the 1930s, Indians made up a huge proportion of Rangoon's population. For many families in Bengal and the Madras presidencies, Burma was not a foreign land. It was simply another part of the Indian world. And that was exactly where the problem began. The system which the British had created contained the seeds of a future conflict. Burma had been tightly integrated into the economy of British India. People, goods, and capital moved freely across the Bay of Bengal. Trade expanded, Rangoon flourished, and the colony became one of the world's largest rice exporters. Yet prosperity brought new tensions. Many Burmese farmers fell into debt during the boom, while large numbers of migrants from India arrived seeking opportunity. To many Burmese, it seemed that the newcomers were benefiting from the colonial economy while the locals were being left behind. As economic frustrations deepened, they became entangled with questions of identity and politics. Resentment towards Indian migrants began to find expression. within sections of the Burmese nationalist movement. From an Indian perspective, this might seem strange because British India itself was a vast patchwork of peoples and cultures. Diversity alone was hardly a reason to create a separate country. But some Burmese nationalists argued that Burma was being governed as a province within a much larger Indian empire, with decisions often made by an administration whose priorities lay elsewhere. As Burmese nationalism grew, a new political question emerged. Should Burma remain a part of British India or follow a separate political path? The surprising part is that the answer was far from obvious. When the issue was debated in the early 1930s, many Burmese politicians opposed separation. Anti separation candidates significantly outnumbered separationists, arguing that Burma would have more influence and greater constitutional protections if it remained linked to India while pursuing greater self government. So, if many Burmese did not want separation, why did separation happen anyway? To understand that, we need to look not at Rangoon but at India. By the 1920s and the 1930s, the British Empire was facing a growing challenge. Across India, the freedom movement was becoming impossible to ignore. Congress was expanding, mass protests were becoming more frequent, and demands for self-government were growing louder every year. British policymakers increasingly accepted that constitutional reforms in India could not be postponed forever. That raised an awkward question. If India received greater autonomy, what would happen to Burma? Would Burma automatically be included in those reforms? Would Burmese politicians have to pursue their interests through institutions based in India? British policymakers were already thinking ahead to future constitutional negotiations with the Indian leaders. The stakes were high. The larger and more united British India remained, the stronger its position would be on the negotiations table with London. For many British officials, that was precisely the problem. Separating Burma would allow Britain to deal with the two territories separately, remove Burma from India's constitutional future, and ensure that any concessions made to India would not automatically extend eastward to Burma. Gradually, separation became the preferred solution in London. Officially, British officials emphasized Burma's distinct history, culture, and political circumstances. But separation also had a practical advantage from the imperial point of view. It reduced the size, population, and political weight of British India at a moment when Indian nationalism was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. In the end, the decision would not be made in Rangoon, it would be made in London, as the British prepared a new constitutional framework for India. They chose to separate Burma from the rest of the Indian Empire. The decision was incorporated into the Government of India Act of 1935, one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of British rule. On 1st of April 1937, the separation officially took effect. After more than half a century of being administered as part of British India, Burma became a separate British colony. It was not independence. The British still ruled Burma, but the political and administrative link with India had been broken. For Indians living in Burma, the consequences were immediate. What had once been an internal movement within British India now crossed a political boundary. Families, businesses, and communities that had grown up around the Bay of Bengal suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a new administrative divide. Yet, remarkably, the event barely registers in popular memory today. In 1937, separation may have seemed like a constitutional technicality, a decision made by politicians and administrators, a few lines drawn on a map. But history was about to give that decision real consequences. Just 5 years later, in 1942, Japanese forces invaded Burma. The British administration collapsed and retreated towards India. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Indians living in Burma found themselves trapped in a war zone. What followed was one of the greatest human migrations in the history of the region. Families abandoned homes, businesses, and possessions accumulated over decades. Many set out on foot, attempting the long journey back to India through dense jungles, mountains, and some of the harshest terrains in Asia. Thousands never made it. Disease, starvation, exhaustion, and the unforgiving terrain claimed countless lives. For many Indian families, Burma had never felt like a foreign country. It was a place where parents had worked, children had been born, and communities had put down roots. Now, almost overnight, the world disappeared. Today, many Indians can trace their family histories back to Rangoon, Mandalay, or Molmeen. Yet the story of their exodus and of India's long connection with Burma rarely appears in our textbooks. In the end, the story of how India lost Burma is not really about Burma alone. It's about how empires create borders, how political decisions reshape lives, and how entire chapters of history can quietly slip from public memory. For 51 years, Burma was governed as a province of British India. Calcutta and Rangoon were connected by trade, migration, and administration. For decades, hundreds of thousands of Indians crossed the Bay of Bengal without leaving the boundaries of British India. But in 1937, that ended. Burma's separation was untimely brought about through a constitutional decision of the British Empire, and not one that the Burmese themselves had asked for. When the British put the question to a vote in Burma, the parties opposed to separation won by a 2-1 majority. Many Burmese politicians feared that separation would cut Burma off from future Indian constitutional reforms and weaken its voice within the empire. But by the 1930s, British policymakers had begun looking at Burma through a different lens. As India's freedom movement gathered strength, they wanted to deal with Burma and India separately. A smaller British India would be easier to manage constitutionally, and any future concession to Indian self-government would no longer automatically apply to Burma. So the British went ahead anyway. Most Indians barely noticed it had happened at all. Today it remains one of the most important forgotten chapters in the history of British India. So the next time you look at the map of India and Myanmar, remember, the borders between them is not nearly as old as it looks. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and please leave your opinion in the comment section, and please consider subscribing. Thank you.